Turning now to the battle of the dueling memos on the Russia probe. On Saturday, a House panel released the Democratic rebuttal to a Republican memo released earlier this month that alleged bias by the FBI and Justice Department in their handling of the so-called Russia probe. What does this mean for the investigation into Russia's meddling in the 2016 elections? For that, we turn to Thomas Dupree. He was Deputy Assistant Attorney General during the George W. Bush administration and is presently a partner in D.C. office of Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. He joins us from the nation's capital, and he wants to be called Tom, and I like that. All right, what's your take on the memo battle and the Democrats' release?
Well, Larry, my take on it is that I think the Democrats' release really puts the Republican memo in context. The thing that struck me, first of all, is that there was, to my mind, a surprising degree of overlap between the facts as the Democrats see them and the facts as the Republicans see them. And in some respects, the Democrat memo confirmed what the Republicans said. But at the same time, I think the Democrats' memo put the Republican memo in a broader context. And what I mean by that is I think it set forth facts that showed that this dossier was not the only item that was given to the federal judge to justify the warrant, and that the application, in fact, articulated that there was a political motive behind the dossier. Maybe it could have been more specific, but at least it made some disclosure along those lines.
Why does the motive matter if the facts are the facts?
The motive matters, Larry, because judges, when they're deciding this case or any case, they are used to seeing evidence that comes in from a source that either has bias or an agenda or might be compromised. And that doesn't mean that you disregard that in its entirety. What it does mean is it means that you're aware of the potential for bias, so you might take the evidence with some grains of salt. You might discount for the bias. So just as the same way that a federal judge might say, well, this information comes from a drug informant who has felony convictions, so maybe you take it a little cautiously or with some grains of salt. That's why I think it was important for this application to make clear the political origins of the dossier, so at least the federal judge would be aware of its source.
What, Tom, do you make of the Rick Gates plea deal with Robert Mueller? What are the implications of that?
Right. I think the implications of that are several. I think the first thing is that it will, in all likelihood, increase the pressure on Paul Manafort to try to cut some sort of deal. I think it also gives Bob Mueller, at least potentially, another witness who can attest to whether or not there was any collusion during the 2016 campaign. Now, look, if there was no collusion, if the president was innocent, then I think they have absolutely nothing to worry about the fact that Gates cut a deal. I think the concern would be if there is something out there that they don't want to see coming out. This gives Bob Mueller another person that he could potentially use to build a case.
What, as an attorney, do you make of Bob Mueller?
I am a big fan of Bob Mueller. I think he is a man of integrity. I think he is a very serious, talented investigator. And I think he's carrying out this investigation in a very fair and impartial way. And look, the fact is if at the end of the day, Bob Mueller clears the campaign of any sort of collusion with Russia, the fact that that verdict came from Bob Mueller, I think, will insulate it from any accusations from any side of the political spectrum that this was anything but a fair and impartial investigation. So I have a lot of respect for Bob Mueller and the special counsel's office.
So you would say the same thing if he indicted people in the administration and came down on the administration?
I would say the same thing, in that I think Bob Mueller is a man of integrity. Now, look, if he were to indict additional people and it turns out that those charges don't hold up, well, then I think we would say maybe he should have built a stronger case, or maybe he had no more business bringing those charges. But if you look at Bob Mueller's career to date and the high respect and regard that he's held, and I really think throughout Washington, I certainly see no reason, he's given us no reason to call into question his integrity or the way that he's carrying out this investigation. Of course, ultimately, he will be judged by his final determination and whether or not he does bring larger charges or broader charges.
The word is from the White House is the president's legal team is willing to have the president sit down with Mr. Mueller, but the questioning would be limited in scope. Why?
Well, it's a classic move, Larry, in that if you are a defense lawyer, you need to be extremely cautious about putting your client in a situation where he could inadvertently compromise himself, either commit perjury or be accused of obstruction or false testimony or something along those lines. You're creating the potential for legal jeopardy from your client. You're creating the potential for the client to give testimony or provide evidence that then could be used against him. So that's not to say that it wouldn't make sense for the president to testify in this case, or for his lawyers to try to work out some arrangement by which he could provide some sort of testimony to the special counsels. In my view, I actually think it would serve a good purpose for the president to testify. But I do understand the concerns that his lawyers have articulated. I think any defense lawyer worth his salt would at least caution his client that if you do want to take this road of giving testimony, it can be a fraught path and one that comes with considerable personal risk.
Do you think he will testify, Tom?
I do, Larry, I do. Now, whether that means an actual sit down with Bob Mueller, I'm not as sure, but at the end of the day, I do think he will provide some sort of testimony. It may be written answers to questions. It may be agreeing to answer specific questions under oath. It may be an agreement to testify within the parameters of certain subject topics. But at the end of the day, I would be very surprised if he simply gave Bob Mueller the stiff arm and refused to testify in any way, shape, or form.
From what you know now, and admittedly this investigation is, Mr. Mueller's is not open, he's just indicting or whatever he's doing, still investigating. Where do you think it's going to go?
Well, that is the $64,000 question. Look, I will say this. We have not seen so far any evidence that suggests that the Trump campaign actually colluded with the Russians. We saw the indictment of the Russian nationals that came out a week or so ago. And to me, Larry, what was telling about that was to the extent it suggested there were people connected with the Trump campaign who had contacts with these Russian operatives, that their involvement was, in Bob Mueller's words, unwitting. You have to think that if Bob Mueller at this stage had some hard, tangible evidence of collusion, we might have seen it by now. Now, that's not to say he's not in the process of gathering it. There might be additional witnesses who give him the evidence he needs, but we're fairly well on in this investigation. And although Bob Mueller hasn't played his final card yet, so far we have not quite seen the smoking gun that some anticipated we would see earlier in this process.
We do know that the Russians definitely interfered in our elections, though, do we not?
We do. We do. I don't think there's much debate about that. And look, I'll tell you, it's not something that happened in the past, in the sense that I think we need to recognize this is an ongoing threat. We have the midterms coming up later this year. I think it is very likely that the Russians are going to continue these types of information operations to try to sow division among the American people, to try to disrupt our elections. And so I'm hopeful that with all the political back and forth about the FBI, that our law enforcement community, we don't lose sight of the larger threat here, which is to say that the Russians, I believe, are convinced and remain committed to trying to disrupt American elections.
Tom, thanks so much for your time today. We hope we can call on you again.
Great. Thank you, Larry.